the theology of ministry of the Second Vatican Council. What do you think is the reason why I chose this image as the background for this slide? Blinking, what are these? Do you know what this is? Do you know what this is? Does anybody know?
Mainframe.
Mainframe. Where is this located? Do you know?
D-pads.
I've seen that in a movie.
In the movie Matrix.
Yes, but this is also what probably in the Silicon Valley where they store all the data, and that's I chose this picture because I think it characterizes Vatican II basically, because there's a lot of changes, a lot of movements. There's plurality in a way, but there is just activity. There's movement going on, but it's constant movement, and sometimes it can be bewildering for a lot of people. Other times it's something that is very reassuring, because up to the Second Vatican Council, the Church seemed to have been frozen in time. And this time, it is more alive, active. Yun lang, nakakalito din. Sometimes you can get confused. But that is basically what we need to understand about the theology of ministry according to Vatican II. Okay. Now, I find that the best way to talk about the ministry according to Vatican II is to address basically the questions that have to do with ministry. For example, what is ministry? How does Vatican II conceive of ministry? What is really ministry? And then second question is, why is there a need to do ministry? What is the purpose? What's the aim of doing ministry in the long run? And then therefore, who are the ministers, or who is the minister? And then fourth, of course, how is ministry to be done? A more practical part, more on the pastoral side. Actually, that would be something that would be carried over to the next part. So, four basic questions. I think when we try to focus on what ministry is all about, according to the Second Vatican Council, we just have to make sure we keep these four questions in mind. So if anybody would ask you, for example, if the bishop were to quiz you on what is ministry according to Vatican II, then you can remember the four questions. What is ministry? Why is there a need to do ministry? Who is the minister? And how is ministry to be done? Okay? At the same time, I think the best way to discuss ministry is in the Second Vatican Council would be to put it, to juxtapose it to the pre-Vatican II idea of ministry. In that way, you're able to see actually what the Second Vatican Council have done. Did they progress? Did they expand? Did they limit the pre-Vatican II kind of idea of ministry, or what? Did they change? Did they adopt something new? So, for example, on the question, what is ministry? Very crucial. What is ministry? For most of pre-Vatican II theology, ministry is basically administration of sacraments. You hear still the expression nowadays that, the priest is going to administer the sacraments, sacrament of baptism, confirmation, the Eucharist. He is going to celebrate the Mass, or he would say the Mass. A very colloquial way of talking about the celebration of the Mass. He's going to say the Mass. I will say the Mass for you. That would be a kind of ministry. So it is very much connected with the sacraments. So for the most part, ministry would always be talking about sacraments. There are other one, of course. For example, leadership can also be considered as ministry. And of course, in the pre-Vatican II era, leadership was a very important part of ministry, because that is actually the claim that the hierarchical leaders would have in order to justify exactly why they have the power over the people, because they have been appointed, they have been ordained as leaders. And so they are administering they are administering the sacrament precisely because they have been ordained by the church itself. Other aspects of ministry would be doing spiritual and corporal works of mercy. You will remember that this is something that you probably have doing the spiritual works of mercy. If I were to ask you what are the spiritual works of mercy or what are the corporal works of mercy, I wonder if many of you will be able to answer. But in any case, that is also an area where certain ministry is being done. And in fact, we talk about the spiritual and corporal works of mercy framework in the pre-Vatican II perspective, we're really talking about something that even lay people are able to do. So spiritual and corporal works of mercy are not limited to people who are ordained. Ordinary people, ordinary Christians can do those things. Corporal works of mercy. You pray for somebody delivered from purgatory, for example, or spiritual works of mercy. It's something that anybody can do. But that is what we would call, quote unquote, second class kind of ministry. In other words, it is something that is lower than the work that is really ministry par excellence, which is the ministry of the priest, the ordained. That is where we start talking about, who will be the real minister, quote unquote, the minister in capital M, uh, rather than not just the people who are deputed by the ordained ministers. Whereas in the Second Vatican Council, when we start talking about ministry, it is much larger than the sacraments. It is basically serving the faith community in the liturgy and in other activities. So you can see already that Vatican II is looking at ministry from a much wider perspective. Much wider perspective. Okay. Not just inside the church, not just within the community of believers, but also even ministry in regard to outside of the church, outside of the community of believers, outside of the community of those who believe in Jesus Christ or even in God. But the Vatican II had always taken seriously the role and the responsibility that the Christian people have towards the world outside. In other words, outside of the fold of the church. So you have a ministry to do. So in a way what do you call this? The object of ministry is much larger in the Second Vatican Council. Leadership basically is, of course, not abrogated by the Second Vatican Council. In fact, it is asserted or reasserted by the Second Vatican Council in chapter 3 of the Lumen Gentium. It's very clear, talking about the hierarchical structure of the church. It definitely talks about the role, the very principal role of the leaders in the community. It is something that is not that was emphasized, of course, wholly by Vatican I, especially in talking about the infallibility of the Pope, but which even people who were criticizing Vatican I were saying that Vatican I were not able to expand the idea of the church and even the idea of ministry beyond the role of the Pope and the bishops. Even the priests were not spoken of in Vatican I. So Vatican II had to redress that lack. The whole idea that Vatican I failed to present a much fuller perspective on the church is now being supplied by the Second Vatican Council. So leadership is reasserted, yes. Involvement in church's social action is also reaffirmed, but now it is not simply doing spiritual and corporal works of mercy. Even outside of the spiritual and the corporal works of mercy, you can also do something. For example, taking care of the workers. At this time, just before the Second Vatican Council, you have the idea of priest workers. Priests who were working in the factories with the work because it is their type of ministry. That was already in existence before the Second Vatican Council. But that is now being given importance by the Second Vatican Council. That in being involved in social action is part of the ministry of the church. So we cannot just say, okay, I will leave politics to to the politicians, and I would just keep myself to the spiritual part of my ministry. We used to think that way, and many politicians still think that way because they would like to safeguard their own position. Whereas many people nowadays would, in the church, would say that, anything that has to do with moral action, the church has to say. The church can say, whether it's the unborn, whether or whether it's separation of families, etc. The church has something to say about this because it is a concern in moral theology. So the church can make a pronouncement on this particular thing. It's a legitimate thing for the church to do because it is precisely part of the response church itself. So as you can see already, the whole concept of ministry has been widened in a way by the Second Vatican Council. And that is because the way the Second Vatican Council conceived of the church was much, much larger than what pre-Vatican II or especially Vatican I had thought of the church. We already have seen that from the Council of Trent, well, even further back to the Middle Ages, the hierarchical society or community that the church is, and of course defined especially in the ecclesiology of Bellarmine, Robert Bellarmine, after the Council of Trent, to speak about the church as a perfect society which is hierarchically organized. As you can see, just by looking at this idea of the church, you already get the impression that the most important part of the church, okay, society is there, but the most important part of society is the hierarchy, the leaders. So that in many ways, the way people characterize the church or use the expression the church, they almost always refer to church leaders. So even nowadays, you read in the papers when you say the church has spoken, etc. Who are they talking about? What church are they talking about? They're talking about the church leaders, the CBCP or the bishops. That is what they're talking about. They're not talking about ordinary Christians. They're talking about the church leaders. And that is the general idea that we have inherited from the Council of Trent, Vatican I. So a pre-Vatican II perspective on the church. Whereas when we talk about Vatican II, it's no longer simply the hierarchy. The hierarchy is recognized, the hierarchy is given importance, but they are part of the bigger reality, which is the people of God, the body of Christ. So, in other words, the church now cannot even just be talking about the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is part of the church, and we say in Lumen Gentium, we say that the church is in the Roman Catholic Church in its form in the best way it can become a church because of the leaders, because of the sharing of charisms, because of the idea that we are in communion with one another. This is exactly what is being experienced in the Roman Catholic Church. But there are also other groups, Christian groups, who also have that kind of an experience. They don't have the what I call is the leadership of the Pope, but they have their own leader. So in their own way, they're also creating an idea of the church which is consistent with their own tradition, but especially going back to the example of the early Christians, because that was how the early church was organized. Different churches everywhere, in Athens, in Jerusalem, in Thessalonica, in Philippi, in Ephesus, etc. These are different church groups. And that is precisely the idea that the Second Vatican Council was trying to recapture. We are a people of God, but we are the people of God in different parts of the world. And we need to respect, in a way a particular local church evolves, because that is how they accept, they receive the message of the gospel about forming a community of disciples. That is how they have received. They have received it in the context of their own culture. So But still, very deeply, deeply theological is the idea of the church as the body of Christ. This is, of course, emphasized by Paul and re-emphasized by Augustine. Body of Christ, in a very rich, concept of the body of Christ, because it really is a beautiful symbol. So, and then in pre-Vatican II, we start talking about outside of the church there is no salvation. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus, which basically sort of put the Roman Catholic Church in a kind of a you can call it a ghetto, or in a kind of in a group that is almost like, it's perfect in itself. That's why it's called a perfect society. Then if you are outside of this perfect society, then how can we even think about salvation if you do not belong to the church? So in a way, that was the whole attitude of the Roman Catholic Church. You are outside of our faith, therefore you do not have access to salvation. Now, the Second Vatican Council is saying that that is not quite right, because God is free to inspire people to believe in God. And who are we to limit ourselves on? Okay, we who follow in the footsteps of Christ, we believe that Christ is the best way to experience God, and so we follow Christ. So that is why we form as a church. But there are other people who are inspired to follow God, or to establish the relationship with God in a different way. And the Church, Vatican II, basically says, who are we to say that is wrong? Okay. So now you don't even hear this expression, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, in Second Vatican Council. It's no longer the perspective. And then, of course, the idea of the fortress church. Because of the Reformation and because of the attacks that were made to the Roman Catholic Church, the church felt it had to defend itself. So it was like a castle. It was like a fortress that had to be defended from the enemies. And the enemies came in the form of people who were revolting against the Roman Catholic Church. They were revolting, as we now know, precisely because of the abuses that was already that was obvious within the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. The Second Vatican Council adds, however, to this idea of the church, the idea that a church is a servant. The church is ready to serve not only the members of the church, but the people outside of the church, society, the world in general. Looks like we have a thunder. Somebody's, I think it's Raphael is having a thunder from Tarlac. Okay. So the church is a servant church, a church that serves people. And it's not there. This is, in a way, a kind of rearranging the whole idea of a hierarchical institution that the church was conceived of in the Council of Trent in Vatican I. Because the impression, of course, that you have when you emphasize too much the hierarchical part is that the leaders are the kings, they are the ones who make decisions. Now, according to the Second Vatican Council, the church, okay, makes the decisions, yes, but the church is there to serve the needs of the community. So not only the leaders are going to serve the community, but each one of us, as members of the church, we are being asked to serve each other. We are all servant to one another. We serve the needs of our fellow members of the church and fellow human beings. At the same time, the church is also a herald church. In other words, it has a message to proclaim to people, not just within the church, but again, outside of the church. So the church has a voice. That's why the Pope is able to address the UN General Assembly, because, of course, he's the head of the smallest state in the world, the Vatican City. Uh, he's a member. He's a member of the United Nations, but he's able. But his voice is much larger than other countries, precisely because of the kind of authority that the church has before this body of nations. So, but because this is precisely because the church has a message to give to all humanity, to share with all of humanity. So, and that is why the church cannot just keep silent, cannot keep quiet. If there are abuses, if there are things that are happening that are not helping people in general, human beings in general, then the church feels obligated to speak up. Otherwise, it will be remiss of its obligation and its responsibility. So the church also has a mission towards society and the world, to humanize the world, but at the same time to uh, to critique in a way the values of the world, consumerism, all of these the isms that we have experienced. The church has an obligation to make a critique of this, to offer its own perspective in regard to this, because Christ, in the same way that Christ himself power structure during his own times, also nowadays the church and church leaders especially would have to speak. So somebody like Bishop Ambo or Bishop Abilio, would speak up in favor of certain things that needed to be what do you call this, to be spoken about. Otherwise, what is the church good for? And the church had proven through time, in the last century, to have been a very important catalyst in regard to action in the world. For example, Francis's encyclical Laudato Si about the ecology was really, because now the Pope had endorsed that particular movement. So it is now something that is to be seriously. And during the pandemic, the COVID-19, the Pope pronouncements, we need to do something about the poorest of the poor who are affected by the COVID, because most of the time they are the ones who are always neglected. So Pope Francis said, we need to take care of them. They have to have equal access to the vaccine and to other facilities that would help them survive the COVID. So that is what the Church of Vatican II had envisioned. A much broader church, much more involved church. Now, we can understand that before the Second Vatican Council, the church must be very protective of its own identity, of its own rights, because there are many people who are already questioning precisely not only the credibility of the church, but especially the authority of the church, especially temporal authority of the church. So, but this, as I said, the Second Vatican Council had in a way, given us a much fuller perspective on the church. Why is there a need to do ministry? According to the pre-Vatican II perspective, because you have been ordained and you have been given jurisdiction to do a particular ministry in this particular place. So it is by ordination that you are made a minister, that you have to do what do you call this, ministry. So ordination makes the priest, the bishop, responsible to lead, to teach the church members, and to make the sacraments available to them. So as you can see, ordination is kind of top down, from the top to the bottom. Chosen as a leader, therefore you have an obligation to take care of your flock. You are the shepherd, you have to take care of your flock. So ministry is primarily yours because of ordination, because you have been called. And that is why some seminarians would like to be ministers. because they are going to be ordained. Okay, nothing wrong with that. But what does Vatican II have to say about this? Why is there a need to do ministry? Notice the difference between pre-Vatican II and Vatican II. Pre-Vatican II goes to ordination. Vatican II goes back further by reason of baptism. Later, for some, not for everybody, ordination. But there is the basic fundamental ground of ministry, baptism. We are all baptized, and by baptism, we have been given that responsibility to do ministry on behalf of the other members of the community, on behalf of the world, on behalf of our society. So much, much deeper, what do you call this, reason for doing ministry. But it means, of course, that so it's not just the ones who are ordained who will be ministers, as we will see in the next question. So by reason of baptism, you are able to do ministry. And because you have been baptized, you, in fact, according to the Second Vatican Council, participate in the very mission that Christ had done and had entrusted to the church. Okay? So you are participating. You are not just saying, okay, I am just being deputed by Father so-and-so or by Bishop so-and-so. No, because you have been baptized, you can say, I have an obligation to do something for others, to do service for others. Now, why is there further a need to do ministry according to the Second Vatican Council? Because of the responsibility of the church to proclaim. The world needs to hear the gospel message. It has to hear the message. Why? For its own good, for the good of the church, or the good of humanity. It has to hear the message. And for the most part, our message has been good, of course. Human beings that we are, we were also proclaiming in so many other ways the sinfulness of the church. But part of the game. But that doesn't detract from our own calling in baptism to participate, to join Christ in his mission to make of the better world a better place. So then, who is the minister, or who are the ministers? In pre-Vatican II, only those deacons and others who were deputed by the bishops, the priests, and the deacons. Okay. Number of people. So minister is not just something that is for everybody. Nowadays, you find a lot of charismatic groups, and they're still very Catholic charismatic groups, but they have a leader whom they call the minister. So, for example, Mike Velarde is a minister for the El Shaddai, but he's also other sub-ministers in a way, because in every El Shaddai group, perhaps there is somebody who is entrusted with leadership. Okay.
Sanchez as well.
In the Second Vatican Council, we're talking now about every baptized person is a minister. Okay, so nobody's exempt. All of us are ministers, but there are some who are ordained precisely for the ministry of ministers. All of us are ministers. There are some people who will take care of the ministers, and that is the leadership position in the church. Notice again how the Vatican II is talking about leadership, about the common, what we used to call the common priesthood. The common priesthood. Everybody participates in the common priesthood by baptism. But there is what we call ordained priesthood, and that is especially dedicated for people who are going to commit their lives in taking care of the people. And that is what we call by ordained ministry. So it doesn't change in a way, the idea of pre-Vatican II in regard to the role of the hierarchy or the priests and the deacons and the bishops, but rather it puts it in a much bigger context. So they are ministers, they are ordained ministers in a community of ministers. The whole church is a community of ministers, but there are some ordained ministers who will take care of this community. That is the way the Second Vatican Council had conceived of the ministers in the church today. There's a bigger group, and there are some select few who will be, whose main responsibility will not be, earning a living or something like that, but taking care of the needs of the community. Okay, so a much, much bigger kind of an ecclesiology. How is the ministry done? In pre-Vatican II, mostly they are done in cultic functions, mass, sacraments, etc. Those are the things that or even priests who are praying the breviary, for example, they are doing the service of praying for the church. That is the basic reason for doing the breviary. The morning prayers and the evening prayers. You're praying for the church. You are officially deputed by the church. You're ordained in order that you will be a prayer person for the rest of the church. You have been given the task of praying for the church. And that is why the priest has to pray the liturgy of the hours, because it is his way of praying for the church. Okay. Nowadays, of course, it's not just the priest who does that. There are many lay people who are also praying the liturgy of the hours, because now it's available to lay people. Some parishes have organized, morning prayers together. Before Mass, they would have morning prayers also together, and lay people come to this, which is a very good alternative to devotions, because you have the liturgy of the hours that is fully sanctioned by the church, and then after that, then we prepare for the liturgy of the Eucharist, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. But that is how Vatican II had, in a way, expanded the celebration of ministry, or the performance of ministry. So not just sacraments, not just the liturgy, but also other aspects, as pastoral works of the parish. And then even a politician can be a minister if the politician is working towards eliminating corruption, if the politician is working towards creating a much more just society, then I think it's also on his part, especially if he were a Christian, that he is doing a Christian ministry on behalf of the church, but for the world at large. In pre-Vatican II, remember, we talk about, ministry sometimes. Could you please, you, Father, so and so, could you please pray for me for this intention or that intention? That is still the mentality of many people. In fact, ordinary people can do the same thing. Of course, iba na yung kuwan, iba na yung pare. Mas mabisa yata yung pare. Mas closer to heaven. That's what you think. I don't know. Maybe the sisters are closer to heaven than the priest. I don't know. Maybe the sisters can tell us about that. In pre-Vatican II also, they would speak about works of mercy, but as something extra, something that is not, part of what we would call the fundamental functions of the ministers. Whereas when we talk about the Second Vatican Council, almost anything can be a platform for ministry. Media. If you notice that the concern for the media has been growing in the church, because that is really something that we need to face. Anyway, it's already here. That is something that is called by the times. So we have to rethink our theology. We have to rethink our sacramental theology, and because of so many things that are happening. I talked to you about the grid. The grid are constantly lighting up in different parts of the world, etc. Okay, so, but in the pre-Vatican II, we always say that ministry is done within the church at Mass, celebration of the sacrament, etc. But in Vatican II, actually, you can do ministry in many parts of the world. So you have groups, for example, who are what we would call lay. They're not religious, but they are lay groups, secular institutes, for example. They have their own jobs, architects, teachers, etc. But they come together as a community at a certain time. Maybe during weekends, they come together as a community to celebrate their own community. That is their own way of living their baptismal promise to live as a community of disciples of Jesus. Okay, so in this way, they are being able to influence other people in the world, or even things in regard to policies, for example, good policies. Okay, all right. So in general, what you can say about the idea of ministry according to the Second Vatican Council, that it had expanded the idea of ministry, not just ad intra within the church, but also ad extra towards society at large, towards the world, towards all of humanity. Okay. And this one involves the whole church, all the church, all of those who have been baptized, you have a responsibility. Okay, so the clergy, the lay, the religious, etc. So the clergy should not be, what do you call this, should not feel threatened in their position that they are no longer, they're not the only ministers in the church. There are other ministers in the church. But if the clergy are serious about it, then they have to really find the distinct character of their ministry, which is to take care of the people. That is, if you take care of the people instead of you, if you enter ministry because you would like to enrich yourself, then it's a different matter altogether. You can enrich yourself probably much better outside of the church, outside of ministry, outside of ordained ministry. There are other ways. But also the recognition, and this is again probably not emphasized as much in the documents, although it says a great deal about it. The idea of charisms, that there are special charisms in the church that are gifts of the Spirit, and they come and they go. Sometimes they come only for a brief time, and then they disappear. But there are special charisms that are to be respected because they are part of the inspiration and the movement of the Spirit itself. And some of these charisms either are given to people who are ordained, people who are lay, people who are religious, people who are diocesan, men or women. So, for example, um, many women, many sisters in Europe and in the U.S. especially, consider themselves as theologians. They have received a special charism to do theology, and it's true. It's true. We have to recognize it. Some of them are brilliant, are excellent theologians, very, very good theologians. And I think we have to recognize it, that is probably the gift of the Spirit. Some sisters would say, I also have a gift to be ordained a priest. Okay. That's another matter. Okay, that's your claim. That's what you're claiming. Then we will have to ask the rest of the community whether that is a rightful, what you call it, charism. And that is what's going to be discussed in the next part, of course. Those of you who are going to talk about the ministry of the women. The reach of ministry, in other words, how far do we go? All dimensions of human and church existence. Every place is a field of ministry. You can go anywhere, Alaska, Timbuktu. Do you know where Timbuktu is? Anybody? I'll give you a prize if you know where Timbuktu is. All right, nobody knows, so no prize. Okay, anywhere. the remotest island in the South Pacific,